let's get started. I would like to welcome everybody, all of our current and former Anthrozoology students, prospective Anthrozoology students, members of our undergraduate program, the Canisius community, the wider community who are present, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Joshua Russell. I am the program director of the Anthrozoology graduate program here at Canisius College. And it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight. A couple things before I introduce her to you. This is a Zoom webinar, so you will not be able to unmute yourself or show your video throughout the presentation. If you wish to ask a question that will be answered at the end of the presentation or after the presentation is over, please submit those questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. You can submit those questions there, and then I will moderate the Q&A session at the end. Excuse me. All right, I would like to start by giving a land acknowledgement. So in giving this land acknowledgement, I invite all of us to reflect on the importance of the land where we are. We're all from different places right now. And to think about the history of that land, its peoples, and the many beings that inhabit these places. Both Canisius, where I work, and Niagara, where I live, are situated on treaty lands, lands steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Hattuwendaruk, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the First Credit. I acknowledge the colonial violence that has occurred here through residential schooling and its impacts on children and families, as well as the many other forms of violent state interventions, many that continue today. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live, work, and contribute to important social and environmental movements in these regions today. And I stand with all Indigenous people, past and present, and promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which I live and work. So I would like to welcome Dr. Alexandra Sasha Protopopova, PhD, CAAB. Sasha is an assistant professor in the animal welfare program at the University of British Columbia and the NSERC BCSPCA Industrial Research Chair in Animal Welfare. Sasha's research aims are to learn more about dogs, improve animal shelter practices, improve companion animal welfare in shelters, pet homes, and in assistance roles, all within a one welfare framework. Recently, Sasha has been shifting her research focus on connecting climate change and other societal issues to companion animal welfare. Sasha earned an MSc and a PhD in behavior analysis from the University of Florida with Drs. Clive Wynn and Brian Iwata. She spends her days conducting research, teaching university classes in animal learning and animal sheltering, going on hiking trails, and of course, cuddling with her dog. So I give you Sasha Protopopova.
Thank you so much, Josh. I forgot how cumbersome and long my introduction that I sent you was.
Great.
I appreciate it. I'm really, really privileged to be with you guys here today. I'm really excited about meeting you all. I know that we won't get a chance actually to visually see you, but I have my Q&A ready, my chat is ready. And I think that's also why you'll excuse me that my PowerPoint is kind of in a funny mode, but this just allows me to see everything and everyone kind of right at once. So I would like us to discuss something that's quite new to me as well, and perhaps also new to you, and that is the relationship between companion animals and climate change. And I say new to me because I think I want to start off with a bit of a kind of a story, or at least not necessarily a story, but something kind of my own thoughts. And so as Dr. Josh told you guys, my previous research and really kind of my education and research has all been around behavior of animals, dog behavior, dog training, and also animal shelter practices. For my PhD, I was really focused on figuring out kind of the marketing aspects of how do we improve adoptions for dogs. And then throughout that, kind of what are some practices within sheltering that we can improve to improve adoptions, improve also human outcomes, animal outcomes, and whatnot. However, at the time, I was also going through kind of some personal changes, but this led me to a bit of a personal existential crisis. And I think perhaps I'm not the only one to experience a personal existential crisis, because you guys are all here also today listening to this talk. And what I mean by this personal existential crisis is that in the news over and over again, we keep hearing pretty dramatic things that are happening in our world. This is especially maybe ironic that at the moment I actually have COVID. I'm COVID positive, and not necessarily that COVID is related to climate change necessarily, but one thing that climate scientists are telling us, that events like COVID or disease events, along with many other kinds of world events, are going to become more and more frequent and more intense. And so in some way, this is quite ironic, but also I do actually want to apologize ahead of time. I do have a bit of a fever, so if I start going off the rails, please let me know, and then I'll try to get back onto the topic. But the personal existential crisis really came about from my research, or thinking about how to conceptualize my research, or what kind of, what do researchers, what do we have kind of to offer to the world under these circumstances. And I bet, I don't know if I'm the only one thinking about these things. Please feel free to put it in the chat if you're also kind of thinking about these things. How does your interest and your research fit into this pretty dramatic global climate that we're in? But what are the climate scientists are telling us? So aside from kind of what I mentioned already, the pandemics, the epidemics, but also climate scientists are anticipating more frequent and intense extreme weather events. So in British Columbia here, where I live in Vancouver, I'm only here 2.5 years, but we are having more and more fires, or at least that's what other residents are telling us, that we're having more smoke than usual, more fires than usual. And unfortunately, this is not necessarily just specific to the region, although as I understand in the news, I think BC was somewhat of a kind of an example of the world catastrophes to come. So again, kind of ironic that that's where I'm coming from to you guys. But one thing that will probably also lead from these more frequent intense weather events is that we are going to have some shortages, water shortages, food shortages. Scientists are thinking or suggesting that modeling, I apologize, that 30% of the Earth's surface will actually undergo aridification, so that we are going to lose our ability to farm that land, which of course will result in fifth decline in food crops. And as you can imagine, what is that going to lead to? Most likely famine. But what happens when these kind of climate events happen is that, of course, they don't happen in a vacuum. People live there. And so the modeling shows that in really dramatic things, unfortunately, in 2050, up to every 8th or 300th, who knows, this is all based on modeling, person will be displaced. So people do have to go somewhere. So there's going to be mass migration events. But what happens with mass migration events is, of course, that we also have more turmoil, more warfare, poverty, extremism, and so on. And so, as you can imagine, as we're bombarded with this information, and as I'm bombarding you with this information, you might feel slightly depressed. And so I apologize, the talk is not necessarily aimed at making you depressed, but unfortunately, this is not just me, this is really what we're encountering all the time. So where does this put us as scientists or as practitioners who are working with companion animals? And what do we have to offer? Do companion animals tie into this world at all? And by this, then considering this, again, going back to my existential crisis, was that I was considering, well, what if I do an experiment asking the question of, does a dog prefer a Kong that's stuffed or not stuffed Kong? Am I addressing any global issues like this? And I think I've answered myself that perhaps not. And so I want to reconsider the kinds of things that, what are we doing and how can we kind of help the world out? Of course, this is very difficult for us because, of course, we're not going to save the world. But nevertheless, I think we get some kind of satisfaction knowing that we're not at least making it worse in that sense. Thank you, Chris, for saying that I'm not alone in that sense. But what about companion animals? So I know that you guys are in this program because you directly understand the connection between humans and animals, and of course also the environment. So one thing that we all learn a lot about is One Health. So what are some examples of One Health that maybe you guys can put it in the chat? In the news, actually, in terms of One Health, there's a terrible news story. Sorry, again, I don't know why I'm being very depressive today, starting very depressive today, but the hamsters are slated for mass euthanasia in Hong Kong because of new COVID outbreak. But those are the kinds of things in One Health that a lot of scientists are worried about. But for us, even though One Health is also very, very important, I think one more interesting aspect is how do companion animals connect with, how does the welfare of companion animals connect to the welfare of humans and the welfare of kind of our societies in general? And I think COVID really showed us this connection. Dr. Christie has published lots of research, so you guys are really, really lucky. Yeah, you guys are really lucky to have this program where you guys discuss these kinds of connections all the time. One thing that, this is already a bit out of date, but we found, not just in our paper, but also other scientists have found that impaired quality of life, for example, during the pandemic, actually did decrease the quality of life or perceived quality of life of their dog, and even increase the perceived development of new behavioral problems. So anything kind of that we do with companion animals also connects human society as well. Or vice versa, anything, for example, that companion animals bring to the table also connect to human society. So we're talking about the hamster aspect or hamster situation, but also another COVID very clear example where owners will in fact delay COVID treatment, or they said that they will delay COVID treatment if they have no one to help out with their dog. And so these connections are really intricate. And so certainly then it allows us the opportunity to consider how climate change, because it's going to affect society, how then is it going to affect our companion animals, and how those companion animals will in turn affect our society. And we know, because I work in animal shelters, we do know for a fact that One welfare and One Health is really very, very related to the services that animal shelters provide. So this is my research that's currently in submission, but this is replicated. This is a replication of plenty of research that looks at what are the reasons of surrender of companion animals to shelters. And my PhD student, Bailey Egan, found that like in most shelters in North America, as this one from the BCSPCA, found that most reasons for surrender are owner related and not pet related, meaning again that human issues are intrinsically tied to animal issues. Yeah, another study that I want to highlight exactly, kind of bring this point yet again home, is by a study by a master student, Lexis Lee, who connected directly human and animal vulnerability. So what she did was very clever. She took census data. This is what you're looking at as a map of Vancouver. So there's a census data, and the census data is subdivided into various categories of kind of vulnerabilities, areas of various kinds of vulnerabilities, for example, residential instability as an example. And she wanted to see if areas with these kind of differences and vulnerabilities of those human populations also are reflected in the shelter data from the BCSPCA. And here is just an example of a map, but she did in fact find that, yes, there were plenty of relationships or correlations between various areas of human vulnerabilities and also different kinds of reasons for surrender. For example, she found that higher residential instability predicts the surrender of animals in the unhealthy, untreatable category of SLMR accords and whatnot. But all of this is really just, again, to clarify that I think all of us, especially you guys are in this program, know very, very well that companion animals is not just a question of biology. We really are. It's a question of sociology, that we're all in one society. We're all living in one society. So this takes us back to climate change. Just recently, or actually last year, the IPCC met again, or this was a group of intergovernmental panel on climate change, where scientists from all over the world came together and brought forward for the public, for us, some direction on what to do. And surprisingly, they still thought that we had something to do. So a lot of us, I think we tend to fall into this kind of catastrophic thinking that, okay, there's nothing to do. We're still going to have all of these effects are going to happen. What are we going to do? But scientists are telling us there is in fact something to do. So if there are immediate, rapid, and large scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we will actually be able to help ourselves out a little bit. Perhaps not solve climate change, but nevertheless, there's something to do. And so with all of this background, we brainstormed with my students and put together our thoughts on a paper. And so I'm coming to you guys to talk not so much from a perspective of being an expert on climate change, but I'm coming to you, a worried person who studies companion animals. So we did the literature review, and so here I am telling you guys what are the kinds of things that we came up with, simply stressing about these kinds of things. And so we'll end the talk and asking you guys to continue brainstorming all together so that we can continue kind of stressing about these things, but hopefully with some outcomes that could be useful. So in this paper, the way that we try to kind of put these things into, because the topic is so complex, so it seems so large, how do we even start to conceptualize these things? So one is that we can clearly separate mitigation efforts and adaptation efforts. So what do I mean by mitigation efforts? Because we are told that it is important for all industries to immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what about companion animals? What kind of effects do companion animals have on our environment? So we can at least start there. So let's do that. So the biggest kind of greatest chunk of greenhouse gas emissions seems to be coming from dog food, from pet food. And I have dog food here, but of course pet food, except cats are will pollute less, and we'll talk about kind of why. So actually, simply because of quantity of food. But impact of pet ownership is dog food. So several researchers have modeled these impacts and have thought that most likely the food impact in the US is that one pet or one typically dog will produce enough emissions to be about 1/4 to 1/3 of a human. So that is really, really dramatic. If you think of how many pets there are in the US alone, so 78 million dogs and 86 million cats in the US alone, what that means is that that's the energy requirements of 63 million humans, which is the 1/5 of the US population. So our companion animals adding 1/5 of the US population on top of that US population. And scientists have coined this impact the ecological paw print, which is very, very cute, but sad as well. And so if you put that in terms of what does that ecological paw print actually mean? And so I've broken it down to make it a little bit easier, because I think or at least if you're like me, these numbers make very little sense unless you can actually kind of visualize what that actually means in terms of kind of details, like what about my pet? And so here, depending on the companion animal size, they will have equivalent ecological paw print. So ecological paw print, the easiest way to think about it is how many hectares are needed to produce the food per year for that animal. You can also have it's very much related to carbon dioxide emissions per year. So you can see here how a small dog is very different than a large dog in terms of emissions. Now, a cat is less than a small dog, simply primarily because of the size, even though we know that cats are obligate carnivores and they will eat meat primarily. Nevertheless, in terms of commercial food, simply due to the size of the cat, the modeling does predict much lower ecological paw print. And so the land required to feed a dog is then directly proportional to the weight of that dog. So here in the y-axis, again, this is just taken directly from the modeling and plotted into the graph just for fun, where these are the football fields required to produce yearly food for your dog. So if you know your dog's weight, you can kind of count how many football fields you guys are directly responsible for in terms of food production. And then, of course, we also have waste. So it's estimated that there's about 10 million tons of waste yearly simply from dog feces. So this is not even counting cat litter. And then total, oh, did I do this wrong? I think, no, that's right. I think this was only for the dogs. I'll double check actually on this in the Q&A. And then feces of all cats and dogs in the US is equivalent to the total garbage produced by 6.63 million Americans. So this is the population of Massachusetts, so just add that in terms of the overall waste already produced in the US. But in terms of what that counts how much is a pet in terms of a single human, it's only about 4% of a single human in terms of garbage. So and just waste by itself is not the greatest pollutant. But I think all of us right away start thinking about the other kinds of impacts that are not easily quantifiable or kind of modeled. We know that the pet industry generally is a $75 billion industry in the US. And so if you just look around your house, actually look around right now, if you guys are sitting in your home, how much plastic or fabric or kind of toys or equipment do you see around that's made for your pet? Or maybe you guys are really, really thoughtful and only reuse items. I know I am not. So I actually, if I look around, I think I'll have a bed right behind me, a dog bed, and I have about 3 toys just to the side of me that are plastic. Doesn't like toys at all. Oh, not quite that, pretty bad. But you can see how much kind of equipment, how much plastic pollution, rubber, all of that is we kind of utilize, and we often don't even think about it because it just feels so good to provide nice things for our pets. So what should we do? In terms of mitigation, my students and I have brainstormed a bit and came up with perhaps something that maybe we are more familiar with if we are doing research, animal research from the animal research perspective. And those are the 3 R's: refinement, replacement, and reduction. What if we consider this kind of aspect of mitigation from those perspectives? And so we try to brainstorm what it means to have refinement, replacement, and reduction when it comes to reducing carbon emissions for companion animals. So in terms of refinement, we'll go through diet, waste management, and then toy supply reduction. For the replacement, I'll talk about species size and breed, and then reduction, perhaps just reducing the overall quantity of animals. So in terms of diet, because we do know that that seems to be the largest emitter, are dog food primarily, not cat food. And so researchers, again, modelists have really tried to, again, take a look at different alternative types of feeding or what kinds of feeding could reduce these impacts. And this is not a lot of research exists on this topic. And so this is something that more research is absolutely needed for this. So one study from China did actually find that if when the population was preparing dog food from leftovers rather than purchasing pre-prepared commercial pet food, they found that the result was 10 times less environmental impact due to food alone. And this was replicated in Japan as well to a similar level. And if you think about it, this actually makes quite a lot of sense. This consideration of, can we feed our dogs leftovers? And what does that mean? In the US alone, about 30% of human food is wasted. And I took a look at the details, and this is just taken from kind of some historic documents about what is the distribution of that waste, or what categories of waste exist. So vegetables and fruit we waste on average about 164 grams per day, 58 grams of meat per day, and 57 grams of grain per day. And in fact, this is actually not very different from what dog food will encompass generally. And I took a look at that in terms of grams, and it's about 2.5 Caesar boxes, maybe enough to feed a Chihuahua. And so that is something that is theoretically possible. Of course, I'll leave it to you guys to consider the health aspects of this. But nevertheless, this is quite an intriguing aspect, because what is the natural history of dogs? We know that only some proportion of dogs actually live in our pet homes. You guys are coming from a very privileged program who really knows very well about companion animals. But maybe you guys can guess what percentage of dogs are free ranging and don't live in pet homes? Who can guess a percentage? In the US? No, in the world. Good question. In the world, what proportion? Joshua suggests 50%, 30% of dogs are free ranging in the world. Catherine says 70. Brianna says 80. Very nice. 70, 80. You're absolutely right. About 80% of dogs in the world are actually free ranging. They're not living in pet homes, or their breeding is not controlled by humans. And so This leads us to one of probably my favorite studies of all time. You're absolutely right, 80%. And so those 80% of dogs, by the way, are not, I know it's not the topic of our conversation, but I love discussing free-ranging dogs generally, but they are not mixed breed dogs in the sense they're just dogs, like cats are cats. You have short-haired cats, these are just short-haired dogs. The breeding aspect is something that's quite recent in some way and quite rare in human history, this kind of targeted closed gene pools. And so most dogs are just dogs. They don't have any breeds. They've never had a breed in their in the history of their lineages. They're just dogs. So it's also really cool to kind of consider these things when we're thinking about mitigation efforts. And so this brings me to my favorite study, I think, of all time, by Butler et al. 2018, where they looked at the percentage of mass in dog feces, or the ingredients found in free-ranging dogs, essentially asked the question of what are these free-ranging dogs' diets consisting of? And so, of course, as we're not surprised that mammal carcasses represent about 50% cooked grain. Of course, once again, this reflects quite nicely our US food waste as well, proportions. But can you see the area in gray? And this is where it's kind of one of my favorite aspects. So it's human feces. So in fact, free-ranging dogs do clean up. They are scavengers, and so they are well adapted to human societies in that sense as well. So now I'm absolutely not suggesting that this is a mitigation strategy, but nevertheless, I think this opens the door for alternative ways to consider our dogs and kind of how do we think about feeding our dogs and what does it mean to be environmentally sustainable when it comes to feeding. And so, yeah, please don't come away from this webinar thinking that this is what your pet dog should be eating, but this is just some food for thought for overall understanding of dogs as species. But let's bring it back into our kind of more modern societies of what about pet food? What about commercial pet food? And so Dr. Christie we were just talking about that there are now new initiatives by pet food companies that are trying alternative proteins or perhaps kind of meatless proteins or adding kind of other components. So one of the things that you guys probably heard about is insect protein. And so this is quite promising in the sense of the digestibility and protein content are excellent. If you look here, it's about 12 times less feed to create 1 pound of meat than a cow, than beef. And it's, however, to create 1 pound of, this is crickets actually, sorry, to create 1 pound of cricket meat, it's only requires 2 times less feed than pigs and chicken, than pork and chicken, which is actually, if you guys are surprised, and this was surprising to me, that it doesn't seem so great. It doesn't actually seem as promising as it kind of originally seems. There's also some, this is kind of another curiosity that there's now kind of ethical questions of course, this means that we might be starting to mass produce insects. Do we have a consideration for welfare of insects farms or not, or do we kind of not care about them and so on? So that's an interesting component to discuss, interesting thoughts there, but I was surprised at how it's actually not as efficient in terms of food conversion than I thought. And so so in terms of the ecological kind of reducing emissions, maybe this insect protein will probably not be the way out for our pets. I also mentioned, and I think I took out the slide, I apologize, about waste. What about waste mitigation? The best strategy is, of course, to compost, but if we live in a city, we probably don't have an ability to compost pet feces. And so there could be some alternative ways. I know that there was also all over the news that some of the compostable plastic bags were not in fact compostable, the poop bags were not in fact compostable. But one thing I think that we can all agree that if all of the pet food industry, the pet supply industry is upfront with the emissions of their products, that we can make those better choices and we can actually try to kind of think about our own decisions. But one thing, oh, thank you, Josh, that, yeah, Ontario allows us to compost pet feces. Great. I don't think we have that in Vancouver. I have to check. I'm pretty sure that they don't allow us yet. So one thing then, kind of from the refinement aspect, so of course there's a lot of place to refine our caring for our companion animals, but replacement is an interesting one. So what do I mean by replacement? So think about kind of a typical status quo situation that you may find yourself in at the moment with your pet, and I'm not judging you, I promise. I also have a very fluffy Australian Shepherd as a purebred. So this talk, by the way, is absolutely not to point any fingers. All the fingers are pointing at myself. But let's say I have a dog and I'm feeding a meat-based commercial diet. I have a large bred dog that I've paid for so that I've created this dog. I perhaps live in Arizona, and my dog is a husky or an Akita, so very, very fluffy. So that means that the climate, the physical climate is wrong for my dog. So perhaps I need to use the car for exercise to bring my dog somewhere where they can run around because it's too hot in the pavement. I need air conditioning. I need to run air conditioning in the house more because now I have a dog that cannot tolerate the natural environment. And as well, perhaps I have a dog that doesn't shed, that does require continuous grooming, which also requires a car, requires continuous electricity and whatnot. So all of those things in terms of kind of replacing is kind of the worst option. So how can we work with this status quo to reduce our impact? Well, one thing is perhaps focusing on thinking about the breed. So not to say that one breed is better than the other breed, but it's to say that perhaps some breeds and morphologies are better adapted to the climate that matches the current climate that we're living in. So for example, if I'm in Arizona, perhaps I want a short-coated, smaller dog that can tolerate more heat events. Then perhaps in terms of I also have a dog that's more adapted to eating leftovers. And so this is what I mean by we have to be a bit careful when I say, oh, dogs can eat leftovers. Absolutely not. Some pet dogs, like my dog, will not be able to eat leftovers. He will need a very expensive veterinary treatment after. But that's not the case for all. So some are more tolerant than others. So could we actually consider this replacement? Could we kind of focus on companion animals that are more tolerant in that sense? And also perhaps low maintenance, that they don't need a car to go out for exercise. They don't need a lot of food, so they have a low metabolism. So because again, our point is not to produce animals, we just need to kind of keep them alive, keep them healthy enough, and so on. And so that could be a better option, thinking about replacement of the companion animal. Now, less pleasant, but even perhaps a much better option is, what about if we don't consider our traditional kind of dogs and cats at all? Of course, we know that pet ownership is prevalent all globally and it's never going away. But if we do have a choice and if we want to be conscious about the environment, what about replacing a pet that actually generates food, like a hen, or perhaps focus on species that can eat leftovers very comfortably? So for example, a rat is quite adapted to human leftovers, or even a pig. This is, of course, how you feel about eating your pet after, which is a bit of a question. But then what about animal shelter? So I mentioned that my research really deals with animal sheltering. And I thought a lot about this from the mitigation aspects. What kinds of roles do animal shelters have in terms of mitigation? And I think reduction is where animal shelters really fall into place, where by reduction, I mean that, of course, if we are generating new animals through breeding, we are, of course, generating new animals. And so they are already existing animals. Of course, those animals are also generated right at some point in time. So this is a bit of a deeper question that I think we'll leave for later. But again, if you're considering for yourself, for your own behavior, what do I do to mitigate my own effects on the environment, then adopting is the option. That makes sense. But here, what I really want to focus on, let's say you are coming from the animal shelter, you're an animal shelter director, and what role would a director then have in terms of these mitigation strategies? Well, one thing, I think, allowing the public to have alternative ways to have contact with companion animals. So for example, through fostering opportunities where they don't necessarily need to adopt, they don't have to have ownership of the animal. Can we reconsider ownership in a different way? What about sleepovers? But even supporting kind of different kinds of adoption that are more tailored towards sharing. So that perhaps we don't necessarily need to have one dog per person, that we could actually have one dog shared across even a couple of family members, or even across families, or even adopting into a community, allowing co-ownership, and so on. So these are, of course, the fostering the sleepover adoption is something that we're all used to thinking about. This kind of alternative concepts of ownership is something that's prevalent in some communities, but certainly not prevalent in other communities. But maybe this is a way that animal shelters can think about in terms of the reduction. Can you guys share your pet with another family? I was thinking a lot about it. I think it's difficult, but if you think about it, I mean, how amazing though to go on vacations and leave your pet comfortably with their other owner. So I think there's some even personal benefits beyond climate outcomes. But ultimately, there is concern, right, that we are still very, very focused on individual animal welfare. And so how do we balance this individual animal welfare and environmental sustainability responsibility? So we know that it's what could be healthy for an animal is one thing, but that perhaps is not necessarily healthy for the environment. So I was a raw feeder for a very long time. Usually, I don't know if there are veterinarians in the audience. This is sometimes tricky to come out and say, but I was a prey model raw feeder. And this, of course, when you're purchasing human grade fresh meat from the supermarket, you're directly kind of being the worst possible, generating the worst possible emissions in terms of kind of what you're doing in terms of pet ownership practices. I also utilize the car a lot to get to my exercise places. But how do you balance these things out? And I think on a personal level, once the animal is already with us, of course, we can only do refinement, only always focusing on the welfare. The welfare is non-negotiable, has to come first. When we're thinking of selecting or kind of planning for the future, or when you're in a position where you have, like a shelter director, you have authority over other programs, this is what I'm talking about, where perhaps we can consider kind of planning society on a greater level, rather than, I don't want all of you guys to necessarily just start feeding only leftovers and never exercising your dogs. So it's a little bit more kind of a higher level of thinking in terms of planning of society. But we're asked, though, from climate scientists and from politicians, is not only to worry about mitigation. In fact, there are two components when we're thinking of climate change, or where we're asked to act. One, of course, is this addressing the causes of climate change, what we were trying to talk about. How do we mitigate our effects? But the other one, for me, is actually much more interesting, but also much more complicated and kind of stressful to think about, is the adaptation piece. So even though there's some wiggle room for us to alter slightly the course of events, however, those events are coming one way or another. So adaptation strategies deal with us addressing those consequences of the events that are necessarily going to be coming our way. And so adaptation, it's anticipating those adverse effects of climate change and taking those appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage it will cause. This is what also we call climate resilience. So what does it mean to be resilient when it comes to companion animals? And again, really from the perspective of sheltering, because this is where my passion is. So let's go into that. The IPCC gives us a framework to consider these things. One thing that I think is really helpful is that they're saying, don't wait on your government and don't wait on your kind of political leaders to do these approaches where not just like focus on regulations at the higher level and wait for those to come into play. Instead, what we're asked to do as each industry or each kind of entity is to consider this bottom-up approach. We're asked as a community or an industry to understand the impact of climate change on ourselves, on our community, because those impacts are known, and we'll talk about what those impacts are. Actually, that was in the very first slide of what is coming our way in terms of disasters. And what we're asked to do is understand how those impacts will actually impact us in our community. And then, given that those are those impacts, what should our priorities be? And should we do something else that we're not currently doing? And so let's go back to that question, kind of what do we mean? So how do we connect these climate change impacts to companion animals with the hope that we can reduce the negative impacts that will come to us? So one very, very obvious impact that's coming our way is extreme weather events. So we have higher frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So those are droughts, fires, well, actually not fires, sorry, droughts, more frequent days of like really, really hot weather. And so what do we know? So these are all already there's plenty of research on, and I realize that I don't have references here, but I'm actually going to go ahead, put this paper that I'm taking all this information from in the chat, and so all those references are there for all these points. So one that we do know that with higher with warmer weather, we do have more dogs dying in hot cars. So this is something that is in fact probably going to be increasing. Also, unfortunately, there are disproportionate kinds of dogs that are dying in hot cars. Who can guess what kinds of dogs are more susceptible to heat stroke? Brachiocephalic, very, very good, exactly. So you're absolutely right. So we have a photo of a brachiocephalic dog. So these are pugs, French bulldogs, anyone whose faces are smushed, and also dogs who are obese. And so those two are really, really important risk factors. And of course, dogs who are very have huge coats. So those three components have been found to be risk factors. Now, this is actually maybe Dr. Joshua and Dr. Christie can help me out. I haven't looked at the very latest data in terms of popularity of breeds, but anecdotally in Vancouver, French bulldogs are the only dogs I see on the street, and doodles. And so this is making me very worried about these kind of specific heat events that we are experiencing, and also worse air quality from the fires that we're experiencing. There are also some other kind of curiosities that are found in the literature. For example, with higher heat events, you also have an increase in dog bites, and in fact, also an increase in rabies infection. But generally, not just rabies, infectious diseases do behave differently depending on different temperatures. So much so that actually various, even parasites, are now expanding their ranges depending on kind of where the warmer weather goes. And Lyme disease is expanding beyond the normal ranges in Canada because of the warmer weather that is experienced. And so this is something that, of course, we're very familiar with with COVID nowadays, but that is something to expect also with our companion animals. But also when it becomes hot out, or really rainy out, or any kind of extreme weather event, we as dog owners don't exercise our dogs. So we stop going outside. And in fact, there's a recent new paper that was just published on this point about seasonal weather patterns and activity and dog walking. So in fact, that yes, there is a difficulty in that we do reduce dog walking. And at the moment, we're also, I don't have any evidence of this longer kitten season, but this is something that animal shelters anecdotally have reported, that they're feeling that they're having a longer and more dramatic kitten season these days. We are right now taking data on this. And so hopefully by next year, we have a bit of more information whether this is kind of, this anecdotal evidence is in fact supported by the data. I'll quickly, we won't touch upon disasters just because this is something that I think all of us have been very much thinking about. And it's a very clear link to companion animals. Of course, we know that where people go, pets go. And in fact, humans don't leave their pets behind very often, also endangering human health and so on. But this is, we will see an increase in disasters and increase in difficulties relates to abandonment and also re-entry attempts at human health outcomes as well. These other ones are more, I think, interesting for us and rather unexplored, in that we are also told by climate scientists to expect giant human migration effects, and that probably this is something that we'll really feel in our political climates. And so how does human migration affect companion animals? And of course, this is where probably we're going beyond our data. We're kind of considering all kinds of possible outcomes, where perhaps if humans are taking their companion animals with them, should we be worried about stress from long distance transport? Should we be worried about zoonotic diseases? Should we be worried about pet abandonment? on the other hand. So again, COVID gave us some hints on what happens to companion animals when cities become vacant. But that is something that probably, unfortunately, will have likely more opportunities to study. Also, of course, with resource loss, we see an increased poverty, increase in inequity. And certainly, as we know from our One Welfare concerns, that these kinds of things will impact companion animals, both in terms of relinquishment and generally in terms of care to the companion animals. And so what does this all mean? So here, I'm going to kind of put all of this together. And again, this is me going now beyond my data and even beyond the literature review. I prepared a bit for us to kind of start the brainstorming in some way, where I have a table of the first column is the societal outcome that we know is going to come our way. We have the impacts that are either based on the literature or hypothesized. And then what could it mean for us to actually create an adaptation strategy to lessen the impact of this impact on our community? So for example, for the societal outcome, we have warmer temperatures, more heat waves, resource depletion. I just put that all in there just for the ease of our table. Probably those things should be separate. So what about impacts of increased heat stroke in brachycephalic dogs? Well, perhaps does it mean that we should be discouraging the purchasing of brachycephalic pets at the moment? If we have an increase in dog bites, does it mean that we should also increase community services, prevent those dog bites through behavioral programs, alert people to these correlations, allow animals to have access to fresh water, to colder areas, and whatnot? Threats to dog walking. Perhaps this means that we should consider novel opportunities for pet exercise entertainment, maybe in the pet home rather than encouraging going outside into the pavement. Does it also mean that we need to design cities to be more green rather than have those just like paved areas where it's very, very hot, essentially you cannot walk, and so on. And so I put in more reduce breeding of incompatible breeds. This is about the climate aspect. So perhaps let's not breed huskies in Arizona and whatnot. And so kind of consider where those animals are actually going and living. And then in terms of kitten season, should we focus on TNR? And if we're thinking about war zones, does it mean that we have a higher need for global thinking? I think this is, again, we had some unfortunate news from Afghanistan, I think about a year ago, a bit less than a year ago, kind of what happens in war zones with companion animals, which also then raises some interesting questions of where does our concern go to humans or animals, and kind of how is it put together? The next one, just again, for the sake of our table, is what about this increased socioeconomic gaps? We know that that results in higher shelter surrender, higher inequity in the community, increased potential for zoonosis. So do the adaptation strategies, could it be that we have to consider our own discriminative practices within sheltering and fight for reduction of those inequities? And again, increasing those community programs. If we have an increase in natural disasters and animals are abandoned, or humans or their owners go into those areas too early, we know that increases homelessness. So for the adaptation strategy specific to sheltering, does that mean we have to focus on emergency boarding, push for pet-friendly housing, increase community support? And finally, this is just my own personal creativity, and I want you guys to be more creative than I am. With this increased infectious disease, we have an increased potential for zoonosis, more veterinary need. Does this mean then we have increased disease surveillance in the shelter and the community and increased veterinary presence? And ultimately, this talk, and I think all of us really kind of, it's really a call to arms. So my existential crisis really just generated more kind of the stressed out thinking, I think generated some ideas of what exactly we can focus on, because a lot of the time these questions, these issues can be so large that we don't know where to start. We may feel paralyzed. But if we break it down into these kind of tables or adaptation strategies, this doesn't seem as difficult to tackle. We can focus on one thing and know that we are making that difference. I realize that I'm also running out of time. Josh or Christy, can you guys say? Oh, I'm okay. Okay, I can continue. You'll stop me, right? And then I've got too far. Don't have too many slides. This calls to arm. But we're not the only ones, right? In this room that we're thinking about this. And in fact, a lot of people in animal sheltering industries are already thinking about adaptation strategies, perhaps even without realizing they're thinking about adaptation strategies. One of them is that you guys might be aware of from your own education, from your own program, is this initiative in the US, but also they have some shelters in Canada that are part of this, is this Human Animal Support Services. And this is an initiative from largely stems from Austin, Texas, but really kind of grew from there with Maddie's Fund support, is recognizing that shelters are in fact, it's a social service, that we're not just operating for the benefit of the animals, but we recognize this one welfare, and our focus is on providing this community support, the social service as part of our community, and considering this kind of alternative to animal surrender. But ultimately, is what the aim here is getting at the root of the problems and dealing with the symptoms. Too often in the sheltering world, we've kind of just sat around, waited for animals to come through our doors. But this idea is that through human animal support services, can we kind of go at the root cause? And ultimately, this is an adaptation strategy because of it targets all of those impacts really, really well. And so with my former student, Dr. Kelsey Brown, we started kind of some research initiatives that are kind of connected to this question of, can we get to the root of these problems rather than kind of waiting it from our end. But one thing that we wanted to start with is really getting at kind of looking internally at ourselves in sheltering and asking questions of what are the problems within our shelters? What are the problems within our shelters in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion that we have? Where does social justice within our own sheltering kind of world come into play? And so we asked 67 experts and scientists in animal sheltering who have an interest in EDI, specifically to tell us, essentially just brainstorm kind of what are the things that we should really be worried about. And here are some preliminary data, qualitative data. I realized that I'm presenting very poorly my qualitative data to two experts in qualitative data. So I apologize for that. But the overall themes were lack of diversity within animal shelters themselves, that animal control typically does focus on punitive approaches rather than supportive approaches, for example, through regulations, laws, and fines, impoundment, things like that. There's a lot of narratives that are harmful, like the ideal home, forever home, responsible pet owner narratives, really blaming the individual person on their circumstances. There's also directly discriminatory ordinances that are in play. For example, breed-specific legislation, spay-neuter, licensing, all of those do impact different populations of people differentially. And also just straight up adoption discrimination. And we're still analyzing that data. We're hopefully to put it together soon, but luckily others have done a better job than us. And there's actually a whole, it's an open access edited journal issue. I was trying to say issue that has several of those ideas within it, and also focusing on EDI and decolonizing animal welfare that are absolutely wonderful if you guys are interested in more about that. But one thing from our own data, just out of, if you guys are curious, we found that these are quotes from experts in EDI and animal sheltering. And this expert highlights our issue really, really well. This expert says, white savior narratives abound. Stories about saving animals from bad people are effective in fundraising. But what about the ethics of using stories in this way? I cringe when I see how we tell stories, imagining the person on the other end, perhaps a single mom who was evicted, or an indigenous family who struggles to care for children due to the effects of intergenerational trauma, reading what we write about how they dumped their animal, failed to get them altered, let them escape, etc. If we need to use emotion to motivate donors, let us shift our narratives so that their sadness and anger is directed in the right place, at the social injustices that lead many people to the doors of our shelters, rather than at the people themselves. So it's just a really wonderful quote from this expert. And I think it just highlights how much work we have to do in sheltering, and again, how that relates to those impacts that we know are going to get worse and worse. The inequity is going to become more challenging within animal sheltering. And I also wanted to highlight kind of where some other research that is relevant to this. Oh, this is not in prep anymore. I forgot to say this is published 2001. Where my student Lexis Lee took a look again at the BCS-BCA data, and she wanted to specifically ask this question about discrimination on the adoption level. She wanted to ask whether it is the case, are animal shelters taking from the poor, giving to the rich? And so she again connected the census data of where animals were surrendered, and she tracked each individual animal to the point of adoption outcome. And she wanted to see whether animals are traveling from poorer areas into richer areas. And in fact, kind of, but not really. So the BCS-BCA does have an open adoption or adopters welcome kind of mindset, but again, different topic for a different time. But in our data set, it wasn't the case that it was true that surrenders were coming from levels of high deprivation, high situational vulnerability. This is a graph from high situational vulnerability, but adopted out equally across different kinds of scores. These are communities with different scores of deprivation. So here you see rather equal distribution on the output side and the adoption side, which is wonderful. However, what we found was not the poor, not from poor to the rich, but unfortunately there was evidence from the white to the white, to be very kind of summarizing the data in a kind of a silly way, where we found that the ethnocultural composition of communities, which essentially is proportion of populations who self-identify as a visible minority, foreign-born, language, knowledge, and with recent immigrants. And so we found that most animals were surrendered from low ethnocultural composition and also adopted to low ethnocultural composition. And so this, and these quintiles are meant to be, they're proportional. So you should be in an equitable world, you should expect to see 20% in each category. So it's not the case that there are fewer areas of low ethnocultural composition. They are equivalent because these are quintiles. And so this is in fact a difference in the use of services in terms of adoption. And so again, kind of highlighting that we do have some work to do with ourselves. But I wanted to end on this kind of brainstorming question, because we covered so many different topics, and I wanted to put it all together into kind of how does it all tie in? And to me, it all ties in from considering these impacts very systematically and kind of carefully, and not get so tied down to considering this whole kind of huge topic of climate change generally, but can we break that down into mitigation and adaptation? So in the mitigation aspect, what ideas do we have to reduce the impact of our pets on climate change? And then on the adaptation side, instead of just thinking, kind of worrying about the future generally, we can break that down into those impacts and really know what do we hypothesize will happen based on that impact, and really deal with those particular impacts directly. And I think that's a way to first not go too crazy, but really make some changes happen. So I'll come back to the slide, but I also just want to thank you guys so much for your attention. This is my email. Please email me with any questions, but I see that we do have some questions come up on the Q&A. And so thank you guys. How do we want to go about it?
Thank you so much, Sasha. That was wonderful. So I did put a message in the chat for people to begin populating the Q&A area with questions if they have questions they would like to ask, and then I will help to moderate those. So while those trickle in, I just want to say thank you again for this talk. This was really fascinating and timely, and it was great to see you just kind of share how it is that you came to this research and the ways in which, you know, your personal motivations and the lit review led to research questions and just this kind of motivation that you have.
Thank you so much. And also thank you, you guys. And I see Dominique says that I didn't even sound feverish, which I'm very surprised because I see myself get really,
Yeah. So I'll start asking some questions. I have a question just personally because when you began your talk, I began to think of the move that people are making to do like sort of climate personal climate checks to see what kinds of threats there are just where they choose to live. So there's a website you can use called Climate Check, and how it may be useful to provide information when people check the climate risks of their home or their neighborhood, to also provide information what that means for their companion animals if they choose to live with companion animals, in ways in which they can sort of make informed choices, just because my background's in education. So
yeah, I think that's a really wonderful tool, and I'd be very curious to see if we could use it that way. There's no reason that, because companion animal, they're part of our everyday life, and so even with like, if that is something that we need for our family, and our family includes a dog, we need to walk, we need to and likewise. So I think from that perspective, it wouldn't be any different than kind of thinking about your lifestyle, your family situation. So I definitely agree with that. I think that's really, really important. There's and there's even kind of interesting relationships between, I was just thinking about temperature of various parts of the city, and you have a relationship between poorer areas and higher temperatures within the city. And so that's, of course, just lack of green spaces and whatnot. So even on a very, very small scale within the city, that will also even have a different impact.
Interesting microclimates and everything. So thank you. So we have a question from Kim Hightower. Would love you to dive more deeply into the example that you raised around pet food, the complex implications around a seemingly simple topic. You touched on questions and resolutions that serve as a model or framework for navigating a lot of ethical questions. How theoretically, and so I'm trying to get to the question, how theoretically and methodologically ought humans best balance the well-being of the pet dog and their biological needs with their own personal ethical lens, including that of the wider environment?
Yeah,
it's a challenging question.
It's I think, yeah, thank you, Kimberly. I think you're highlighting one of the most kind of crucial difficulties in all of this, is that, yeah, it's all nice and great to reduce our carbon footprint and kind of thinking about these things, but here we are, we're tasked with maintaining good welfare of our companion animals. And how do we put those two things together? I think on a personal level, the easiest ones that are not to do with pet food. But when it comes to pet food, then it becomes tricky. For me, it means moving away from human food grade ingredients. And so I've moved away from that in commercial pet food. And I've noticed that my dog seems to be okay. So I think maybe it's a trial and error perspective. In some way, not being scared of byproducts. If you go to the commercial route or even the non-commercial route, utilizing byproducts that are safe but not nice to eat for human consumption. So that could be a way. But again, it's very, very challenging. And I think it's much easier to think about it both theoretically and also planning in the future, like what kind of animal to obtain, and rather than kind of in the moment trying to figure out how to maintain welfare, acceptable levels of welfare.
It'll be interesting to see how shelters begin to make those decisions, even for people in a way, like how. Yeah. Robin's question is, have there been any studies on the climate impacts of communities with free-range dogs? If they're eating waste, could they be acting to mitigate climate change via less methane or need for waste handling? Super
clever, Robin. Excellent question. So I've asked this question to some scientists who do study free-ranging dogs, and the same ideas came into their minds. So it seems like my favorite study that I mentioned is not replicated completely across different populations of free-ranging dogs. So that location, I believe it was in North Africa. I think I don't remember actually what location, but I know in India, several research sites are not reporting that human waste is a large proportion of feed. And so I think that might be kind of both regional, but I think it's such an interesting hypothesis about if they are functioning as scavengers and actually can dogs themselves be used to mitigate. We need more data on this because it's super, super interesting. And are they eating also, let's say, cow feces? And so that could also be an interesting. So yeah, if anyone's looking for a research topic, this is the excellent research topic. I totally agree.
Yeah. There's a question from Malini Suchek. You alluded at one point to either or thinking, that is, when approaching some of these issues, asking, is it our duty to help humans or other animals? So how do we move from that either or thinking to both and thinking?
Thank you, Malini, for a very good point, and that's a very good correction that I definitely want to say both and so I might have to check my own language at some point. I think you're totally correct in that it's never and or. When you are helping animals, you need to help people, otherwise you're not helping that animal, and vice versa. So I think they're in the sheltering world. This is a really, really good point. It reminds me, I don't know if I'm again going off the topic, so please guide me back. But when restrictive adoption practices are there in place only because they're trying to protect the animal, but by doing so, they can endanger the welfare of the animal by not having an adoptive home at all, or even being kind of too quick to seize the animal from its original home rather than providing assistance to the human. So, seizing the animal is of course not a great outcome for the human, but also certainly not a great outcome from the animal's perspective, because they are typically bonded to the human. The shelter is not a nice place at all to be in, and so on. And so I think this kind of realization of that we're in a sphere of one welfare is now finally coming to sheltering, but I think absolutely not everyone is there yet. And so this is something that I think we need to have these conversations and provide that data for the shelter administrators to make those kind of programs, put the programs in place.
Thanks for that. Question, how much of the responsibility of companion animal driven climate change is on pet owners versus large corporations in the pet industry? They say, I have a difficult time rectifying the amount of greenhouse gas production from corporations when we shift the focus to individual responsibility and the it starts in our own backyard philosophy. Wonderful,
Emily. I 100% agree with you. You guys have some serious good questions. I cannot agree with you more. And this is actually why I occasionally struggle talking about mitigation, because to me, it absolutely does what you're saying we shouldn't be doing, is putting this responsibility on the individual owner. And we have it's not us. We're not the cause. I think one way, though, is speaking with our money. I think here we do have a responsibility. I think we, in the sense that, for example, if we as consumers do start pressuring the pet food industry to tell us the emissions resulting from their pet food and make choices based on the packaging. So based on that data is provided, of course, are they going to be truthful? That's a different question. But nevertheless, I think in terms of where we spend our money, that matters. But it's also, again, we can choose not to purchase things. So I think it's more from a purchasing perspective. I totally agree with you, and that it is not us. It's the industries that need to step up to the plate. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a tricky, challenging question for anybody working in climate science, climate education. Is this individual versus community or organizational or government responsibility?
Yeah, it reminds me of I don't know. This is certainly a feverish response, but it reminds me of another question I had in terms of kind of individual responsibility question. where going into this idea that millennials, I think that's kind of how the news always tells us, millennials are opting out to have pets and not having children, and so on. And so then I did explore a bit in the research of what does it mean? Is it the case that when we have pets, we actually have fewer children? And so that's great, right? Having fewer children is really the ultimate reduction in emissions. But unfortunately, data is not so supportive of that. Is that pet ownership are typically with families, and so it's not that we opt. Oh, unlike the Pope has said,
Right.
it does not seem. I forgot about that point.
We're a Catholic Jesuit institution, just like the Pope. So it's interesting to bring that up.
The data is not supporting that. What is it? The millennials are choosing their dog over their baby. But yeah, it would have been curious, but it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah. So can cat and dog waste be composted? If so, I assume it has to be done in a more complex way, higher temps that people are capable of home. Are there cities who offer this service? And I realize Christy wrote me, I didn't put this in the public chat, I only sent it to you and Christy, that where I live in Ontario, they do collect dog waste as long as it's in compostable bags for the compost. But you can address this in your own way.
Yeah, there are, I know there's some online tutorials on how to create a compost for your, for, I guess, your feces as well, companion animal feces, all of them. I mean, one way, I'm not sure if it's better or not, you can put it in a human toilet to flush it down. You can utilize it through that as well. But I don't know, but I think there are tools available online in that.
Yeah, interesting. So there's the whole issue about the welfare of animals used in animal food, that is feeding our companion animals, I assume. Is the production of these feeder creatures really calculated in the use and waste?
Yeah, Catherine, that's exactly how they calculate the emissions. So because a lot of the pet food does come from byproducts of the human food industry, the human meat industry, or for consumption by humans. And so it's calculated from kind of taking that already into account. So the emissions are not, they're coming from the feeding of the animals plus the transport of those animals and whatnot. So it's the full agricultural sector. So it's not just, yeah, so that's what that implies, like the food impact is that.
It's interesting when you mentioned earlier about, not shying away from byproducts, because that probably reduces things in the way that you're talking about, right? Do you worry that your research on companion animal ownership and climate change could prompt blame and finger pointing at dogs, cats, and other pets?
Yeah, thank you, Florence. And this is a really good ethical question, and I've asked myself this question as well. But I think, yeah, what is our duty as researchers, really? It's a kind of a good one. What are we responsible for when we kind of come out with data? And that's a whole topic for the ethics of research in of itself. I think for me, it's not as, I mean, I cannot live without a dog. I'm a dog lover. But I think I don't know. It's a really, really difficult question, actually. It's difficult. And I think I don't have the answer to it. I think it's a discussion over some drinks. Long discussion, lots of drinks.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated about the educational implications of providing some of this information to people. So we should do virtual drinks and so we can meet in person and talk about that. Yeah. Are there other questions, or Christy, I don't know if you had any questions you wanted to ask directly.
Oh, I see some questions in the chat.
Right.
I think, yeah. So Tori asked, where are animals being fed inadequate foods if buyers rely on packaging to determine which food they use? I think you're totally right in that. How much do we trust the pet food industry to tell us the truth about things? I don't know if I'm just being too pessimistic about them, but it's just one kind of, one more regulation. But again, they do listen to us in the sense of what consumers want, even if they think we're stupid about it. They still follow along with those trends. And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't have the answer there, but I'm also not sure what alternative we have, unless kind of because I think the industry, we have to disrupt the industry. So how do we do that? Either we stop participating at all and rely on our own home feeding through leftovers, or we pressure them into some direction that we want them to go in. Oh, and Ashley, oh yeah, so I'm not the only one of my feverish thoughts about children. Very good, Ashley. I totally agree with you.
Oh, there's an interesting question there about cremation of pets.
Oh, I never thought about that, Kelly. Super interesting. I think, sure, cremated. I know from the sheltering perspective, like in the shelter I was at in Texas, at one point in time, luckily not at the moment, but they were euthanizing about 80 dogs a day. And all of those went to the freezer first for storage. This was also kind of a question of storage. That takes a lot of energy, and then trucked over to the dump site and then buried. So I wonder what kind of that's a lot of mass. Quite interesting. And of course, that doesn't. We're not considering anything with pets. I mean, that's a giant amount of. Yeah, very interesting.
It makes me think of Desmond Tutu when he was recently, when he died recently, he was aquamated, which is like an aquatic form of cremation, which apparently is more environmentally friendly. But I guess that brings up questions of access and who can afford to do those types of things as well, right?
Right, and I think it's illegal, right, to bury your animals in the backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, or in some areas, of course, not in all. Yeah, really interesting question. I never thought about that.
There's a question in the Q&A. Does your research at all look at loss of biodiversity from outdoor pet cats?
Yeah, no, we don't. But this is somewhat neglected. Yeah, I didn't touch upon this point at all. But this is a huge point. So it's as you guys probably know well from your classes and your own probably research, that there are kind of several camps fighting with each other continuously in terms of data. That some will say that cats are not the main reason for the biodiversity loss. Others they are, and so on. And so I'm not following that research very well. So I probably wouldn't be the one to focus on this one.
Other questions?
In Alaska, you can bury your pets.
I'll just briefly mention at Canisius, we have Borders and Migrations initiative that brings a lot of guest speakers, and we've had guest speakers talk about climate migration. And it'll be interesting to follow as climate migration begins to happen more and more, people bringing their pets, or the interesting point that you made about, and that's really important about diversity and inclusion, is that whether people will begin to tell stories about adopting pets from places that were, climate, that had climate disasters, and whether that would become a new narrative of saving animals from those locations. But yes, I thought I'd plug that other series of talks we have. Well, if there are any other questions, I want to, on behalf of everybody, thank you again for being a wonderful guest speaker. And you provided your contact information, I believe. And we hope you keep in touch with us. For those of us in the Anthrozoology program, the master's program, we do have a Q&A session tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And Christy will be there to moderate that. But yes, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you guys so much. This is so wonderful. And also it's been a while since I've had such good questions. I think I'm gonna have to think about them for tomorrow. Probably. Yeah. I look forward to tomorrow.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.